Hi, I'm Serafina, and this is Book, and Away. This book is called Giants Are Very Brave People by Florence, Parry, Heide. Everybody's afraid of something, but Bigelow was afraid of everything. Well, not everything. He wasn't afraid of his mother, for instance, but he was afraid of just about everything else. He was afraid of clouds. They might fall on me, he said. He was afraid of alphabet soup. What if I swallowed letters that spelled a magic word that would turn me into a mushroom? He asked. He was afraid of the rain, so he carried a big red umbrella everywhere, even on the sunniest days. Rain might melt me, said Bigelow. Nonsense, said his mother. Why would rain melt you? It's just water. You don't melt in the bathtub, dear, and that's water. As soon as she'd said it, she was sorry, because then Bigelow wouldn't take a bath. Not without a lot of fuss, anyway. You needn't wear your raincoat in the tub, dear, said his mother. One day, Bigelow was out walking. It was bath time, and he thought he'd rather walk outside and take a chance of the clouds falling on him. If he saw one coming, he would jump away. It was better than melting in the bathtub, certainly. He was so busy looking up at the clouds that he didn't look where he was going, and the first thing he knew, he heard someone doing a lot of very shrill screaming. He looked down and saw a little old lady running around on the ground. Bigelow had never seen such a little lady. "Excuse me," said Bigelow. "Is that you screaming down there? Is there anything wrong?" "Wrong!" cried the little lady. "What's wrong is that you're stepping on my garden. And the next thing I know, you'll be stepping on me." "Of course I won't step on you," said Bigelow. "I was just looking up in the air, checking the clouds, instead of down at my feet, checking the chances of stepping on very small people. Now that I know you're down there, I'll be very careful." Go away, screamed the lady. "I'm afraid you might eat me up." "Eat you?" asked Bigelow. "Why would I eat you?" "Because you're a giant, that's why." "I am?" asked Bigelow in surprise. "I didn't think I was a giant. I just thought you were very small." The lady peered up at Bigelow. "You didn't know you were a giant?" she asked. "Of course not. Everyone I know is my size. Regular size, that is," said Bigelow. "I never saw a little wee person like you before." "I'm regular size," said the lady, whose name was Mrs. Pemberley. Mrs. Peter Pemberley. "Oh, no," said Bigelow politely. "I'm regular size. I'm sure you are just extremely small." He started to sit down. "Not on my house!" screamed Mrs. Pemberley. Bigelow found a place that was not the house, or the garden, or Mrs. Pemberley, and sat down. Mrs. Pemberley came closer. "I thought giants were very fierce," said Mrs. Pemberley. "Well, they are, I believe," said Bigelow. "Being just regular size, I am not particularly fierce myself. In fact, I'm afraid of just about everything." "You are?" asked Mrs. Pemberley. "Yes, I'm afraid so," said Bigelow unhappily. "In all the books I've read, giants are very fierce," insisted Mrs. Pemberley. "I never travel, so I've never seen any before today, but I'm sure they're fierce if the books say so." Now that she had stopped screaming, Mrs. Pemberley was speaking very softly, and Bigelow leaned closer to hear her. She screamed again and jumped away. "I just wanted to hear you better," said Bigelow. "Would you mind if I put you on my shoulder? Then I wouldn't have to listen so hard." Mrs. Pemberley looked up. "It's not a trick, is it?" she asked. "You won't get me up there and then eat me?" Of course not, said Bigelow. He picked her up and put her on his shoulder. It wouldn't matter your being afraid of things, said Mrs. Pemberley, except that you're a giant, and giants are very brave people. Bigelow decided not to argue any more about the giant business. After all, if she realized she was really so small, it might make her nervous, and she was nervous enough already. It matters to me that I'm afraid, said Bigelow sadly. I mean, it's boring. Like right now, I'm afraid that when I stand up, I might hit my head on the sky. That's silly, said Mrs. Pemberley positively. It's easy for you to say it's silly, said Bigelow, when you're never going to bump your head on the sky. Unless, of course, you're still on my shoulder when I stand up. Then you might. Nonsense, said Mrs. Pemberley. You know what I think? I think that if you acted very brave, you'd feel very brave. You do? Asked Bigelow doubtfully. For instance, said Mrs. Pemberley, if you would go around shouting a giant sort of shout, that would make you feel braver. What's a giant sort of shout? Asked Bigelow. Well, the only one I can think of offhand is fee-fi-fo-fum, said Mrs. Pemberley. All giants know that one. I'm surprised your mother hasn't taught it to you yet. Why don't you practice it for a while, and I'll go in and make some tea. Bigelow put Mrs. Pemberley down. And some crumpets and scones and ice cream cones, said Mrs. Pemberley. Oh, good, said Bigelow. He practiced saying fee-fi-fo-fum while Mrs. Pemberley went into her house to make the tea. He felt pretty embarrassed practicing a giant sort of thing when he knew that he was just regular size, but anything was worth trying. He was just saying fee-fi-fo-fum very softly to himself for the 87th time when Mrs. Pemberley came out with the tea things. Fee-fi-fo-fum, said Bigelow in a loud voice. Mrs. Pemberley threw up her arms and screamed. Then she saw Bigelow sitting there. Goodness gracious sakes alive, said Mrs. Pemberley. You certainly scared me. That's a very good shout. I'm sure it will make you feel much, much braver. She looked at the ground. I spilled all the tea things, she said, and went into her house to get a broom and dustpan. It was all my fault, said Bigelow, as Mrs. Pemberley swept up the crumbs and the broken dishes. I'm sorry I frightened you and made you break your dishes and spill the tea and the crumpets and scones and ice cream cones, he added wistfully. It was only my second best tea set, really, said Mrs. Pemberley. But I'm afraid that that's the last of the crumpets and scones and ice cream cones. I hope you're not hungry. I'm starved, confessed Bigelow. I could eat anything. You could? Mrs. Pemberley moved uneasily toward the door of her house. Not you, of course, said Bigelow hastily, but just about anything else. Would you like some nice alphabet soup? Asked Mrs. Pemberley. No, thank you, said Bigelow. I'm afraid of alphabet soup. I'm not afraid of pancakes, though, he added. So Mrs. Pemberley went in to make some pancakes. Bigelow carefully turned over and lay on his stomach. He propped himself up on his elbows so he could see in the kitchen window. Mrs. Pemberley made pancakes, lots of pancakes. As fast as she made them, she handed them through the window. There now, she said after a while, that's the last of the pancakes. Bigelow's face fell. The pancakes were so tiny, they had hardly been a mouthful. He'd better go home to a regular-sized meal, he thought. I don't know how your mother manages to feed you, said Mrs. Pemberley, coming outside. That was 73 pancakes. My mother's pancakes are pretty big, explained Bigelow. Mine were pretty big, said Mrs. Pemberley. Yes, of course, said Bigelow politely, and very delicious. And thank you very much for the pancakes and for the fee-fi-fo-fum thing. I'm sure it will help me in getting braver. Bigelow stood up. He ducked a little in case he was going to hit his head on the sky, but he didn't, and that made him feel a little braver. Not much, but a little. The sun was bright, and Bigelow saw his shadow on the ground. Usually, Bigelow was afraid of his shadow. Now, he said, "Fee, fi, fo, fum!" The shadow still looked pretty scary, so Bigelow stopped looking at it altogether. He looked up to see where the clouds were. There weren't any. Good, thought Bigelow. It was a little too soon to practice being brave about the clouds. "Would you like to come home with me?" asked Bigelow politely. "I'd like my parents to meet you. Otherwise, they won't believe me." "What size are your parents?" asked Mrs. Pemberley cautiously. "Regular parent size," said Bigelow. "Just as I thought," said Mrs. Pemberley. "Bigger than you, I think," said Mrs. Pemberley. "I think it would be best if you visited me instead of the other way around. And actually," she said, not wanting to hurt his feelings, "actually I never visit anyone of any size. I never go anywhere. I never travel or anything." Mrs. Pemberley sighed. "I've never even been on a train," she said wistfully. "That's probably why I've never seen any giants before. You have to travel to see things like giants." "I'd be afraid to travel," said Bigelow to himself. "I might see a giant." Aloud, he said, "I'll go on home for supper if that's all right with you." "Oh, quite all right," Mrs. Pemberley assured him. "Do try to come back tomorrow to practice being brave. Come after you've eaten," she added. Bigelow said goodbye and started home. Supper was ready, and it was alphabet soup again. "Fee, fi, fo, fum," said Bigelow. "What, dear?" asked his mother. Bigelow looked at the soup. What if he did swallow letters that spelled a magic word that would turn him into a mushroom? He'd never forgive himself. "Fee, fi, fo, fum," he said again, louder, and started to eat the soup. He ate it all but the letters. He left them, just to be on the safe side. He'd eaten the soup part, anyway. Mrs. Pemberley would be very proud, he thought. Since he hadn't had his bath at the usual bath time, it was bath time now. It was always bath time, thought Bigelow. "Fee, fi, fo, fum," said Bigelow. "What, dear?" asked his mother. Bigelow sighed and climbed into the tub. "Are we giants?" asked Bigelow while he was having his bath. "Giants?" asked his mother. "Oh, no, dear. Giants are very big. We're just regular size." "I met someone very small today," said Bigelow. "She thought I was a giant." "That's nice, dear. You're growing up to be a big boy. That's probably what she meant." "Oh," said Bigelow. "Fee, fi, fo, fum," said Bigelow to himself as he climbed out of the tub. Thank goodness he hadn't melted that time. "Really," thought Bigelow, as he took off his rubbers and raincoat and dried himself off, "I do think I'm getting a little braver after all." The next morning, after a breakfast of regular-sized pancakes, he played with his train. He had a very nice train. It had an engine and a freight car and a passenger car and a caboose. A passenger car. Bigelow thought for a moment. Then he got a big box. He packed each car very carefully in the box. He took the train track apart and packed it in the box. Then he carried the box downstairs and outside and walked until he came to Mrs. Pemberley's house. He set the track up and he connected the cars of the train, and then he knelt down to the kitchen window. He whispered, "Good morning, Mrs. Pemberley," very softly so as not to frighten her. Mrs. Pemberley looked out. "Goodness gracious sakes alive," said Mrs. Pemberley. "A real train!" "All aboard," called Bigelow as he wound up the engine. Mrs. Pemberley ran out of her house and climbed into the passenger car. Away went the train, and away went Mrs. Pemberley, round and round and round the track. "I'm really traveling," said Mrs. Pemberley happily. She ran out to the caboose and waved to Bigelow. Each time the train came around to where he was sitting. "You can see a lot when you travel," said Mrs. Pemberley. "Giants and everything." Bigelow was so busy waving to Mrs. Pemberley that he forgot to be afraid of the clouds or his shadow. He even forgot to say fee, fi, fo, fum.